The Harry and Meghan Oprah interview hasn't yet brought down any members of the royal family, but it has already led to the resignation of one of the most prominent members of Britain's media aristocracy. Yes, Piers Morgan has left Good Morning Britain. Tonight, me and Aaron Bastani will be discussing whether this is part of a wider reckoning within Britain's press or just a dramatic way for a spotlight-loving TV host to move to a new, better-paid gig at a different channel, a more right-wing channel where he can be more open than he already is about his political beliefs. Aaron, how are you doing?
I'm very well, Michael. How are you?
Very well. I have to say, I was quite surprised when I initially heard this news, but I think by now I've kind of made sense of what's going on, which is what we're going to be explaining to you tonight.
You're here to enlighten everyone, as usual.
Exactly. Although, to be honest, there is going to be some speculation in tonight's show, but I think it's kind of clear what's going on. We will not just be talking about Piers Morgan and what his departure from ITV says about Britain's press. We will also talk about the ongoing fallout over the government's proposed pay cut for nurses and some polling which shows why kicking Corbyn out of the Labour Party might not have been such a bright idea. As ever, do share the show link. We want to get more people watching live. Tweet on the hashtag TiskiSour. Put your super chats under the YouTube stream and comment on our Twitch channel. First story, you know what it is. Piers Morgan is the best and the worst of British journalism. Throughout this pandemic, he's been more effective than any other broadcaster at holding the government to account. However, he's also just as willing to turn his ire on the most marginalised in society. When he's not grilling Gavin Williamson or humiliating Matt Hancock, he can be found mocking transgender people or shouting down women of colour, all to boost his audience. In short, he's a talented broadcaster, but he's a cynical one, and he can often verge into being actively dangerous. It's more than justified then that most on the left cheered his abrupt departure from ITV's Good Morning Britain. That was, of course, after he was heavily criticised for dismissing Meghan Markle's account of considering suicide. This was the initial and very short statement from ITV. So they released the following statement that following discussions with ITV, Piers Morgan has decided now is the time to leave Good Morning Britain. ITV has accepted this decision and has nothing further to add. Morgan is understood to have left the show after a clash with ITV executives. So they had requested that he apologise for his comments about Markle. He refused, and then he walked. Piers Morgan spoke to the press this morning, and he was sounding quite unrepentant.
I believe in freedom of speech. I believe in the right to be allowed to have an opinion. If people want to believe Meghan Markle, that's entirely their right. I don't believe almost anything that comes out of her mouth. And I think the damage she's done to the British monarchy and to the Queen at a time when Prince Philip is lying in hospital is enormous and frankly contemptible. So if I have to fall on my sword for expressing an honestly held opinion about Meghan Markle and that diatribe of bilge that she came out with in that interview, so be it.
So it's not difficult to see how positioning yourself both as an outspoken defender of the royals, an outspoken attacker of woke culture, and also a victim of free speech warriors, people who are trying to stop people say what they really think. This is positioning Piers Morgan, I think, for probably a new job. I don't necessarily think this is him falling on his sword, because that is, he thinks that now is the time to make a personal sacrifice. So if he's ever made one, that would be a surprise to me. And we're going to discuss what all of this means. First of all, I do want to take you through the series of events that led to this departure. So first of all, as we discussed on Monday, Morgan's immediate response to the Meghan Markle interview was to claim she was lying.
Okay, again, let's have the names. Who did you go to? What did they say to you? I'm sorry, I don't believe a word she says, Meghan Markle.
Well, that's
I wouldn't believe it if she read me a weather report. And the fact that she's fired up this onslaught against our royal family, I think is contemptible.
So in response to that, him saying, yes, she might have said she felt like she was close to suicide, but I don't believe her, she was lying. That prompted an angry response from the charity Mind. And this is quite significant as they've partnered with ITV on ITV's Get Britain Talking campaign. So that's a campaign for us to talk about our mental health issues and to reduce the stigma and essentially are supposed to believe people when they talk about the issues they're going through. So Mind said, "We were disappointed and concerned to see Piers Morgan's comments on not believing Meghan's experiences about suicidal thoughts today. It's vital that when people reach out for support or share their experiences of ill mental health, that they are treated with dignity, respect, and empathy. We are in conversations with ITV about this at the moment. If you or anyone you know is feeling impacted by the discussions that have taken place today, please reach out for support using the signposts in the thread below." So that was the statement from Mind. That obviously concerned bosses at ITV. And then on Tuesday morning show, Piers Morgan issued the following clarification.
On mental illness and suicide, these are clearly extremely serious things. They should be taken extremely seriously. And if somebody is feeling that way, they should get the treatment and the help that they need every time. And if they belong to an institution like the royal family and they go and seek that help, they should absolutely be given it. And if it turns out Meghan Markle, and it's not for me to question whether she felt suicidal. I wasn't in her mind, and that's for her to say. My real concern was a disbelief, frankly, and I'm prepared to be proven wrong on this. And if I'm wrong, it is a scandal that she went to a senior member of the royal household, told them she was suicidal, and was told she could not have any help because it would be a bad look for the family. Yeah. If that is true, A, that person, if they're still there, should be fired. And B, the royal family have serious questions to be answered about how they handled it.
So you could see that as a very different tone from Piers Morgan. He's saying, if that's how she felt, who am I to question that? But you'll also note there was no apology. But the tone was different. It was clear that someone had had words with him. Even if he was sounding, taking a few step backs from the brink in that particular monologue, just a few minutes earlier, in fact, earlier on that show, Piers Morgan hadn't taken it very well when co-host and weatherman Alex Beresford called him out on his coverage of the Oprah interview.
And I understand that you don't like Meghan Markle. You've made it so clear a number of times on this programme, a number of times. And I understand that you've got a personal relationship with Meghan Markle, or had one, and she cut you off. She's entitled to cut you off if she wants to. Has she said anything about you since she cut you off? I don't think she has, but yet you continue to trash her.
OK, I'm done with this.
No.
Sorry, no.
Sorry. So, do you know what? That's pathetic.
You can trash me, maybe, not my
No.
See you later.
I'm being...
Sorry, can't do this.
This is absolutely diabolical behaviour. I'm sorry, but Piers spouts off on a regular basis, and we all have to sit there and listen. 6:30 to 7 o'clock yesterday was incredibly hard to watch.
Now, that was viewed millions and millions of times on social media. And when I first saw that, I thought, to be honest, this looks like theatre. Potentially it was pre-planned by the show producers, basically to boost ratings. It's great for GMB whenever it goes viral for whatever reason. That was why, I was slightly surprised when then he resigned. That obviously put it in a different light. That makes it seem as if, it hadn't been planned by the producers of that show, at least. Another piece of information which makes it seem like that was potentially not pre-planned, that there actually was beef at the top of ITV, or at the top of Good Morning Britain, was this tweet from Chris Shipp from today. He's ITV's royal editor, and he tweets, "So the Duchess of Sussex formally filed a complaint to ITV on Monday. It's thought to have been sent to the broadcaster's CEO. Meghan raised concerns about how Piers Morgan's words affect the issue of mental health and what it might do to others contemplating suicide." So the chief executive of ITV had a complaint specifically from Meghan Markle. So quite a powerful woman. Mind, the charity they're aligned with Meghan Markle, someone who's popular with, very divisive figure, it turns out, if you're looking at the polling, but popular with a broad section of their audience, has complained. It seems like they asked for apology from Piers Morgan and he walked. Aaron, what do you make of this? In terms of ratings, Piers Morgan is clearly an asset for ITV. So I'd be surprised if they just, fired him, if they didn't give him a way to stay. But he's clearly decided that he doesn't want to apologize. He's perfectly happy to walk away from the show. What's your interpretation of what's gone on?
Yeah, I think there's a few things at play. So firstly, Piers Morgan has a history of being a high-risk journalist. You cast your mind back to the Iraq War. He, of course, put that infamous front page on the front of the Daily Mirror. At the time, he was the editor. He had to resign over that. Now, the photos, it turned out, weren't accurate. They didn't depict scenes that had happened. Although, it must be said, torture was inflicted on Iraqi nationals and others by Brits in Iraq. That's a matter of fact. But it wasn't depicted properly by the Daily Mirror. So Morgan's instincts were right that there was some veracity to the story, but these photos were forgeries. So he went. So he takes risks as a journalist. However, I don't think that's what this is, because this isn't journalism, Michael. What we saw repeatedly with those videos is just if. You know, even in the second video where you're right to say he was more considered, he clearly sort of tried to pull back the emotional aspect of his arguments. Again, if I don't believe her. Why? Is there a countervailing source who's telling you actually she said she was depressed, but I know that she did X, Y, Z, which would undermine that story? If you haven't got that evidence or those sources or those witnesses or that testimony, it's just an opinion, Piers. It's not journalism. You know, you can have 5-6 million people watching at home. They can say the same thing. I have a feeling she's lying. I don't have a feeling she's lying. I believe her. You know, your job as somebody on megabucks is to be able to get different threads of different arguments and ascertain the truth. Now, that's a separate point to what he said in terms of questioning Meghan Markle's suicidal ideation, the idea that she was considering suicide. And I think that's surely why he went. You know, he made a bunch of other really objectionable, unacceptable comments, but I think that was why he went. Because even the royal household, and like you say, the partnership with various charities, and I don't think it's just mine. There's so much of this stuff now about being alive to mental health and mental ill health. I think that was unacceptable. And I think he went a step too far. Was that calculated? I mean, evidence would suggest, given what he did at the Daily Mirror with Iraq, that wasn't calculated. Maybe this wasn't either. Maybe he's got too high off his own supply. He's had a fantastic year with COVID. That mixing, obviously, his personal enmity, which is pathological to Meghan Markle. I mean, it just borders on obscene hatred. You covered it really well with Ash on the last show. Seems to come from a really strange place of inadequacy and ineptitude on his part. I think has created this really toxic bromide. I don't think it was part of some big plan for him to leave ITV and go elsewhere, no. But I do think this is probably played out quite conveniently in terms of how he wants to pitch himself going forward.
I mean, I don't think it was a plan where he was like, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say Meghan Markle was lying, and then I'm going to get a mental health charity to write to ITV, and then I'm going to quit. I don't think it was planned in that way, but I do think that probably one of the things going on here is that it's quite likely that GB News or News UK, the two organisations which are planning to start quite well-funded right-wing platforms, had approached him and sort of, you know, casually discuss the amount of money he could earn on their platforms. This is speculation, but people have written this about both platforms, that they are courting Piers Morgan. And so when he, you know, and I think he was probably already considering that, you know, he has to get up quite early. Maybe they were offering him an evening show. Maybe they were offering him bigger bucks. And probably in his mind, he was thinking, well, to be honest, it is actually more influential being on ITV, which is, you know, a channel that everyone watches, as opposed to a more marginal right-wing channel. But they're going to give me more money. It's at a better time. And then this was the moment where he was like, you know what? Why am I going to apologize for this? I'm off. I'm going to get the big bucks over there, and I'm now going to milk this. And when I say he's now going to milk this, let's look at what he tweeted this morning, which had a picture of Winston Churchill, so you can see what he's going for. But he tweets, on Monday, I said I didn't believe Meghan Markle in her Oprah interview. I had time to reflect on this opinion, and I still don't. If you did, okay. Freedom of speech is a hill I'm happy to die on. Thanks for all the love and hate. I'm off to spend more time with my opinions. Now, to be honest, that more time with my opinions can be quite a direct reference to one of the talking head channels, which we can expect to arrive. But the point there is he's completely moving away from this. Yeah, obviously, it's not for me to question someone else's account of suicidal ideations. Now he's saying, no, actually, I've got nothing to apologize for. I am basically a victim of woke culture. I'm a free speech warrior. And I mean, I think you can read into that. Watch this space. So I would be very, very surprised if we don't see him fronting a show either for GB News or the News UK Murdoch run platform. This does leave a bit of a hole for ITV. I think 1.2 million people watched their show on Monday. So significant, and often it, you know, at least on social media, it can set the agenda for a day. Questions as to what will happen to it now. There were some clues this morning. Well, I suppose actually there weren't many clues. That's to potentially overstate what you're about to see. But people were waiting to see what Susanna Reid, his co-host, would say. Here she was speaking this morning on GMB.
Piers and I have disagreed on many things, and that dynamic was one of the things that viewers loved about the programme. He is, without doubt, an outspoken, challenging, opinionated, disruptive broadcaster. He has many critics and he has many fans. You will know that I disagreed with him about Meghan's interview. He himself clarified his comments about her mental health on the show yesterday. There are many voices on GMB and everyone has their say. But now Piers has decided to leave the programme. Some of you may cheer and others will boo. He has been my presenting partner, Monday to Wednesday, for more than 5 years. And during Brexit and the pandemic and other issues, he has been a voice for many of you and a voice that many of you have railed against. It is certainly going to be very different. But shows go on, and so on we go.
My question for you, Aaron, is I suppose about the media now and what this says. You know, who's up and who's down when it comes to channels and ratings and the fight basically for dominance over Britain's media space. And I mean, I think probably this is, you know, Rupert Murdoch and Andrew Neil at News UK and GB News are going to be licking their lips, and ITV are probably going to be a little bit worried now about how they replace such a big character in the morning, even though I think most people are right, or most progressives are right to find him incredibly objectionable because of the way he treats marginalized people. But that's obviously not a problem for ratings. What do you think this says about the future of the battle between different formats and different channels?
Do you know what, Michael? I think purely from a business perspective, forget politics, forget who would be best for the job, although I happen to think this person would also be best for the job. Purely from a business perspective, creating great TV, getting people talking, getting people watching that program in the morning. Do you know who I think should replace Piers Morgan?
Yep.
Ash Sarkar.
Yeah, I knew that was coming.
Purely from a business perspective. And, you know, I would hate to lose her here at Novara Media. It would be a huge blow to this organization, but I'm putting my objective journalistic hat on here, Michael. Purely from a business commercial perspective, she would be phenomenal. Because the question now for ITV is, clearly there's a big division in values in this country between older people and younger people. It's not universally true, but it's clearly a thing. Piers Morgan, Andrew Neil, Rupert Murdoch, the things they say appeal to certain demographics more than others. And Good Morning Britain isn't a young person show. You know, 18 to 35-year-olds aren't watching ITV at 6:30 in the morning, generally speaking. So they're going to find it really hard. And I think Ash is a young person, fantastic, charismatic, funny, intelligent woman who would appeal to that younger market. But I think she's still got really vital things to say to people of all ages and backgrounds and colours and creeds. So that would be my advice to ITV. Piers Morgan's gone, get Ash Sarkar.
No, I completely agree. And you said, you know, it would be a shame to miss her, but I'd hope she could host Good Morning Britain in the morning, have a nap, and then come on Tisky Sour on a Monday morning as well. Maybe we'd have to switch her days around, but you know, whenever she wants to come on Tisky Sour, she can come on. I think we'd get to keep it. I think we can have both. We can have Ash in the morning on GMB and then Ash in the evening on Tisky Sour. That's what I'll be telling myself, because you've got me all nervous now, Aaron. I think the serious point you raised there, I mean, obviously it's serious that Ash would be a great host of that, is that what people are talking about with the development of GB News and this new News UK channel is that it's sort of aping the American opinion-led TV, so Fox News, MSNBC, those channels where you've basically got a big character who's talking to camera for an hour or so, giving their opinion. And it's something that we haven't really had on British television, partly because we have Ofcom and a regulated press, which is very different to what they have in the United States. But with these channels coming along, that seems that it will change to some degree. And one thing that raises to me is, given we've got a very sort of divided society, and there is a market for conservative shock jocks, but there's also a market for liberal talking heads, are one of the existing channels going to take on the position of being the liberal channel? So, for example, in the United States, Fox creates a space for MSNBC. In this country, if we've got GB News, is that going to create a new channel? Obviously, unfortunately, we don't have enough money yet to get a DAB license or a license to go on national television. So are some liberals going to come together with millions of bucks and sort of say there's space for a rival? Or are Sky News going to decide we've got to be the liberal ones now? Or is ITV going to decide we've got to be the liberal ones now? Where do you see that going, Aaron?
3 letters, BBC. You know, people with a left-wing persuasion, liberals, social liberals, people in the centre, generally don't think they need to get involved in media projects, or haven't for the last several decades, you could say arguably since the 1920s, because of the BBC. And it's true that it's been a major counterweight to a very, very, very increasingly right-wing media, vociferously right-wing media, particularly since the early 80s, particularly since Murdoch bought the Times and Sunday Times. But that, I think, is now becoming undone, because the BBC had this huge market share of radio, of TV, of online in the last 15 years too. And now what we're beginning to see, Talk Radio, LBC, GB News, you know, News UK, Times Radio, is this kind of fragmentation going on. Not with print, but with other kind of hybrid multimedia, which, of course, these guys, in terms of scale, can't take on the BBC or even ITV, or arguably even Channel 4. I'd say LBC and Channel 4 are around the same size. But what they can do is they're basically going to create a whole ecosphere of alternative political reality. And they're all going to repeat each other's arguments. You know, Guido Fawkes will say something, then LBC will run with it. Then Talk Radio will get the person on to talk crap for half an hour, and then they'll do the evening show with Piers Morgan, and then Andrew Neil will be doing the press review, you know, the next day. And I think that's going to be a very powerful media ecology and environment for the left to grapple with. And I personally feel that particularly centrists don't really know what's coming. They have no idea. You know, the 2019 general election was hugely unfair to the Labour Party. It was a disgrace. You hear Labour politicians time and time again saying we deserve to lose. I mean, in a sense, of course, because it's the will of the people. But at the same time, in terms of how the media influenced the outcome, it's never been that bad. That's before talking about various Facebook groups which were funded through all manner of shady ways. But my God, get ready, because 2024 will be even worse than 2019. You know, those organizations like Leave.eu and, you know, Brexit Central, those were kind of marginal Facebook groups in 2016. By 2024, those are going to be really big media outlets, parroting effectively the same kind of arguments. And I feel like, in a way, the left is at least prepared with an analysis of what that means, albeit, no, we don't have the money. I do think that centrist tendency of kind of byline Times, people's vote kind of people, I think they're recognizing it, and maybe it'll get bigger. They're going to get money, but no, nothing like what we're seeing with GB News and so on. I mean, GB News is getting money from hedge funds based in, you know, the Arabian Peninsula, from the Discovery Channel. You know, Andrew Neil's got sort of contacts which go back decades in the media industry. So it's going to get really, really ugly, Michael. And perhaps you're right. Maybe that means that ITV now have an opportunity to pivot more towards a younger millennial audience. The problem for them is they're all online. You know, they're not watching as much television as older people. So it's a really pressing challenge. For outlets like ourselves, that's great, because, you know, we have an expanding audience, because younger people are moving towards more progressive arguments. Fantastic. But no, I think for the next 5 years, it's going to get worse before it gets better.
I think that's probably a safe bet. We have 3,000 people watching, which is lovely to see, especially, you know, when we're talking about how the right seem to be getting their act together in terms of putting forward their own ideological agenda. So we are desperate to build Novara as quickly as we can, so that we can get out to as big an audience as we possibly can, hold politicians to account, and push against, I mean, probably the narratives of which you're going to see Piers Morgan spouting in a year's time on a new cable channel. So if you want to help us grow, please do go to support.novaramedia.com. Donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. And very important, subscribe to the YouTube channel, because we want to make sure this is growing apace. A couple of comments as well. Raji Adi with $4.99. Thank you very much. Good riddance, Piers Morgan. Have to see more diverse and professional journalists on TV. Wholly agree. Ishtak with $4.99. Ash on a new Big Breakfast show for Channel 4. She would be so good at that. Although she would also be so good at Good Morning Britain. I think Ash is a very versatile broadcaster, so I think could host actually most shows. You know, Newsnight, Good Morning Britain, The Big Breakfast.
I don't know, Michael. Can I just say I kind of disagree with that.
Really?
I don't know. Why would she? Newsnight's really boring. 500,000 people watch it. Ash should be hosting something which has got like 3 million people watching. I think that's insulting to Ash. I think she has mass appeal. Because she does this thing of bringing together high and low brow really, really well. You know, she can get the most kind of I hope she doesn't mind me saying this, kind of, quite, how can I put this? Carnal jokes and, sexual innuendo or whatever, with really, really, really high theory. And very few people do that. And she does it in a way which is, my God, this show is basically becoming an advert for Ash Sarkar. We should become her agents. Let's just turn Novara Media into an agency for Ash Sarkar. But my point is, Michael, I don't think she would excel at just like serious Ash Sarkar doing Newsnight. 500,000 people are watching. Oh, here's Donald Trump's spokesperson. I'm going to savage you and show everybody how stupid you are. She might do that, the kind of Emily Maitlis one-dimensional thing. Ash Sarkar, Michael, she should be doing 5-6 million people watching shows. And yeah, Good Morning Britain isn't that, but it has that mass appeal which Newsnight doesn't have, BBC Question Time doesn't have. I think she could be a very popular broadcast figure.
Yeah, I wholly agree, and I'll apologise to Ash after the show for suggesting that she would lower herself to hosting Newsnight. We're going to go on to our next story, which is very much related. It's the media fallout still from that royal interview. On Monday, we showed you a statement that the Society of Editors released in response to Meghan and Harry's interview. Now, in that statement, they took issue with the claim that press coverage of Meghan Markle had been motivated by racism. The statement included the following. The UK has a proud record of calling out racism and also being at the forefront of campaigns to support mental health awareness, a number of the issues raised by the couple. They also said the UK media has never shied away from holding a spotlight up to those in positions of power, celebrity, or influence. If sometimes the questions asked are awkward and embarrassing, then so be it, but the press is most certainly not racist. Now, we read this live on Monday's show, not having seen it before, and me and Ash couldn't help but burst out laughing. I managed to read it with a straight face then because I've now read it a few times. The Society of Editors, none of us had heard of it before this Monday, I have to admit. It's made up of media bosses. But apparently its whole board was not consulted before that statement was released from their director, who's a guy called Ian Murray. Now that statement, very defensive, saying, no, the media is not racist. I don't know what Harry and Meghan are talking about. That did cause disquiet among some people in the press. So after its release, editors at The Guardian, The Financial Times and The Huffington Post expressed their discontent. Rula Khalaf is the editor of the FT. She said, there is work to be done across all sectors in the UK to call out and challenge racism. The media has a critical role to play and editors must ensure that our newsrooms and coverage reflect societies we live in. A similar statement was given by the editors of The Guardian and The Huffington Post, basically saying, look, there's more to be done. This is not the way someone should respond to allegations such as those levelled by Meghan Markle. As well as those three editors, opposition to the statement from the Society of Editors was expressed by more than 160 journalists of colour who signed an open letter calling for calling the Society of Editors statement laughable proof of an institution and industry in denial. So they wrote, we, the undersigned journalists of colour working in UK media organisations, deplore and reject the statement issued by the Society of Editors denying the existence of racism and bigotry in the UK press in its response to Oprah Winfrey's interview with the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. While Meghan's comments shone a light on her own personal experiences of discriminatory treatment, they reflect the depressingly familiar reality of how people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds are portrayed by the UK press on a daily basis. They go on in that letter to list many studies, actually, which have highlighted the structural racism of the British press, how it marginalises different ethnic groups in the UK. We're actually going to run through some of those in a moment. First of all, I want to jump forward to the end of that statement from the 160 journalists. So they write, the Society of Editors should have used the comments by the Sussexes to start an open and constructive discussion about the best way to prevent racist coverage in future, including through addressing lack of representation in the UK media, particularly at a senior level. The blanket refusal to accept there is any bigotry in the British press is laughable, does a disservice to journalists of colour, and shows an institution and an industry in denial. So a very strong letter there. Many signatories from The Guardian, from The Huffington Post, from Novara Media, from Channel 4. And yeah, I mean, a message which seems to have resonated with many people working in the press and who have an awareness of Britain's press. A few hours before the release of that open letter, though, the executive director of the Society of Editors, Ian Murray, went out batting for the original statement. Here he is speaking to the BBC's Victoria Derbyshire.
Can I ask you about those headlines again? The Star asked whether Harry would be marrying into gangster royalty.
I'm not going to defend one headline.
Sorry, Mr. Murray, you just told me. Excuse me. Please, may I speak? Please, may I ask the question?
The huge amount of coverage.
Mr. Murray, you can continue talking over me, but I want
2 examples and say, look, here's something that someone might point to and say, so therefore that means that
you told me, Mr. Murray, you told me the British tabloid press was not bigoted. I've just given you some examples. You're denying that those examples are racist. And I'm asking, why are you denying that?
Well, and I'm making the plain to Victoria that what we're saying, I'm not defending individual things here and there. I'm looking at the whole thing. When you say that someone might make one comment about something, and I'm not saying whether those were bigoted or racist at all.
Well, let me ask you, as the Society of Editors...
I never get the chance to actually finish, Victoria, my point. When you actually label someone as bigoted because of one example that is disputed, and actually say, and not taking the whole thing in the context and saying, look at the way that they have covered it. I'm afraid that's if you keep on looking, you will find that needle in the haystack.
Right, but you just told me that the British press isn't racist. And now you're saying if you keep on looking, you will find a racist needle in the haystack. So let me ask you again, are those headlines racist? Simple yes or no?
I'm not going to stand to defend and say whether they are not. What the context is.
You're the Society of Editors.
Sorry, Victoria, you know full well, because you are a journalist, you've got to see the context.
Well, let me give you some context then, please.
Out of things, and I'm not saying whether they are or they aren't.
Well, let me give you some context then. The headline, which suggested that Meghan was almost straight out of Compton, underneath says, Prince Harry's new girl, Suits star Meghan Markle, is from Crenshaw, LA. Crenshaw has endured 47 crimes in the past week, including murder. Gangs, including the Bloods, count the neighbourhood as their territory. Markle's social worker mum, Dora Ragland, lives in the rundown area, and the actress's aunt is in a nearby gang-afflicted Inglewood. Is that racist? Are they racist stereotypes?
I'm saying I can't say that is racist. It's a straightforward rags to riches story about saying factually, if it is factually correct, that it is that's the background to Meghan Markle. I don't know whether it's factually correct or not.
Now, if you were in any doubt about whether or not our media is run by people who are willfully ignorant, in fact, of the importance of what they write and the racism that can be inherent in so many front pages in this country, if you weren't already persuaded, watch that video and you can see, I suppose, the depths to which those at the top of this industry will go to ignore what's right in front of their faces. It's also important to note that this isn't just, this issue is much more important than just headlines about the royal family, the unequal treatment of different members of the royal family, even though, those are indicative of a deeper rot. And credit to her, Victoria Derbyshire also raised those broader issues. So she put to Murray some of those broader problems with Britain's press, and we can take a look at his response to those.
In 2016, a report by the European Commission against racism and intolerance found that hate speech amongst traditional media, particularly tabloid newspapers in this country, continues to be a problem. Do you not see that at all?
Do I not see what at all? Do I not see that? Do I agree with their findings? That I have not read that report recently. I'm not going to say that I completely agree with their findings. I need to look further into it, but it's what they're actually basing this on.
Do you think there's a difference between someone like yourself, a white man, the Society of Editors, contemplating racism on an intellectual level, and black people experiencing it on a daily basis? I
would say that I'm not bringing my racial background into this. I would say that if I'm asked whether the last sections of the British media, the tabloid press, are racist, I would say no, they are not. And some extremely decent journalists, many of which you probably know, who work on the papers that are being pointed at, would be horrified, shocked and disappointed to have that levelled against them.
So his argument there was basically, I'm going to ignore all of the evidence you've given me about the structural racism of the British press. I'm going to read that later. I don't really believe him. And then his main argument is people would be really hurt who work in the press to be accused of racism. Now, everyone's hurt when they're accused of racism. I mean, maybe someone like Donald Trump isn't, maybe someone who's an avowed, overt racist wears the badge with pride. But most people, if you call them racist or suggest they're racist, they're deeply offended. So what he's saying is absolutely true. But that is no reason whatsoever to say, oh, it's an illegitimate argument then. I'm going to talk you through some of those studies going into the structural racism in the British media in one moment. First of all, Aaron, I want to hear from you about what did you make of that outing from Murray there?
That guy was like an advert for everything that's wrong with the British media. You know, we don't even need to do a show about this. We could have done a 5-minute show, Michael. You could have played bits of that and just said, and we could have just laughed over the top. It's kind of, yeah, that's exactly right. It is case closed. And I think what he demonstrates in that clip is a very convenient myth for many people in this country, particularly people in privileged positions. And there are many myths at play in 21st century Britain, but this is one of them, which is that we live in a post-race society, that race doesn't matter anymore, that, you know, I don't care what the color of your skin is, I see past that. And that's a very convenient myth for powerful people and people with resources and people with privilege. You don't have to work a minimum wage, who don't have to spend 60% of their money on rent every week. It's a really, really convenient myth because it does two things. Firstly, it means they don't have any responsibility to change anything. They don't have to do any work in terms of themselves and society more broadly to dismantle racism, right? The fact that we've got unemployment statistics differ hugely for a Bangladeshi man in Tower Hamlets than do for a white guy in Surrey. That's a racist issue. And the point is, if you say, well, we're in a post-race society, you can just close that off and say, well, we don't have to deal with that. And that's really useful for those people. So that's the first point, and why that myth is so welcome for them. The second one is that fundamentally liberal politics over the last 40 years, which has become the kind of default idea of progress, it's no longer socialism. This strange liberal politics is about, I'm a good person. My political commitments are, I'm a good person, really. And this is a real interesting representation of that. Because if you're a good person, then how could you be complicit in systems of racism? If you're a good person, then how could you be enjoying privilege which other people can't? And so the myth is a very, very useful one for so many people, which is why it sustains for so long. You know, I did probation, Mike. I don't mind saying this. I did probation for violent disorder. I was arrested on a protest. And violent disorder is a very serious charge, very serious crime. And the people I met while doing probation, do you know what color their skin was? 90% of the time, Michael? It was black. They were all black. Now, there were some older people, generally women, and they were done for speeding. And I was like, wow, you're here for speeding. I'm here for violent disorder. Like, the maximum sentence I could have got was 5 years. And then there were young kids that basically just had fights at school and they were doing community service. And I kind of was standing there and I was like, does nobody find this strange that everybody in this room, I'm the whitest person here. Does nobody find this odd? And of course they all found it odd. It was an open secret, so to speak. Even the two probation workers were both black guys. One was from Jamaica. Well, they're both from Jamaica. One had come over in the 60s. So he didn't sound as Jamaican as the other one who'd come here more recently. And of course, everybody understood that this is a deeply racist country. And that's not just about prejudice in the workplace or discrimination on the street. It's also about your access to resources. That to them was common sense to the extent that 2 + 2 = 4. But for this chap, that isn't the case. Why? Because it doesn't suit him. How's it in his interests for him to recognize this is a huge problem? It isn't. So this myth of post-race is incredibly useful, incredibly convenient, but it's most certainly not true.
I mean, I think that's really, really well put. I did probation for aggravated trespass. I also did community service, cleaning up rubbish around my home borough, but it was exactly the same. I think I was the only white person there. Right, let's look at some of the studies that have gone into the structural racism of the British press. So the report that Victoria Derbyshire referred to was from the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance. That's an organ of the European Council, which is the organisation of European states. Now, they found that Britain's press, in particular the Sun and Daily Mail, had fueled prejudice against Muslims and LGBT people. And that is not the only report, of course. There's quite a few more. So there's also one by academics at Cardiff University. This was for the UN Refugee Agency. So as you'll see, these are all from very distinguished international organisations. They found that the British press is uniquely aggressive in its coverage of migrants and refugees. This one's really interesting. They reported, or their report examined 2,000 news stories across 5 different European countries. So it's across Spain, Italy, Germany, Sweden, and Britain. And in that comparative study, they found that humanitarian themes were most common in Italian press coverage. That's 51% of articles were humanitarian in Italian press, and rarest in the right of centre-right British tabloids. So in the Daily Mail, only 19% were humanitarian. In the Sun, only 8% were, and the EU average was 42%. In contrast, the British right-wing press was found to feature accounts which stressed the threat that refugees and migrants pose to domestic welfare and health systems at a much higher level than the other countries in the sample. So the Daily Telegraph was 16%, the Daily Mail 42%, and the Sun 26%. So this is articles about migrants which focus on the threats that migrants pose to health and welfare. Now, that was much higher than the EU average, which was 9%. So the EU average 9%, just the Daily Mail is 42% of stories about migrants in the year of this study, which I think was 2016, were about how migrants are a huge threat to domestic welfare and health systems. I mean, that will be familiar to anyone who's familiar with British news, but it's good to have it out there to show that actually this isn't what the media is like everywhere. I mean, I'm sure there are racist newspapers everywhere, but the extent to which the British press is just relentlessly putting out negative stories about Muslims and about migrants is unusual. You know, it's more extreme than elsewhere. Our final report is from the Muslim Council of Britain. They found that in the final 3 months of 2018, of over 10,000 articles and media clips about Muslims in the British press and British media, 59% of all articles associated Muslims with negative behaviour, with terrorism as the most common theme. The worst offender, again, was the Mail on Sunday, where 78% of stories featuring Muslims had a negative theme. So this is relentless. It's not so much about each individual article taken separately. It's about the totality of them, which is actually very relevant in terms of what the Society of Press, or the Media Association guy was saying, which is, he was saying, I'm not going to talk about individual headlines here or there. And in a way, he's right. It's not actually individual headlines here or there that matter. What matters is the fact that from the British press, what you are getting is this relentless day after day after day after day of negative stories about Muslims, negative stories about black people, negative stories about immigrants. And of course, that has a pernicious effect on our society. Now, the defense which is often given by the press in response to the claim that they promote racism is that they just reflect views which are already out there. If the press is imperfect, that's because society's imperfect. Now, just passively reflecting racism isn't a particularly good defense, but it is one they draw upon. And this was actually an issue which Prince Harry brought up in that Oprah interview. Now, this went out after the interview because it wasn't included in the original 2 hours, but CBS put out clips afterwards. Let's take a look.
One of the people at that dinner said to me, please don't do this with the media. They will destroy your life. This person is friends with a lot of the editors and like that. And I said, sorry, just elaborate. What do you mean by that? Obviously, I knew. He said, you need to understand that the UK is very bigoted. And I stopped him. I said, the UK is not bigoted. The UK press is bigoted, specifically the tabloids. Is that what you mean? He goes, no, the UK is bigoted. And I said, I completely disagree. But unfortunately, if the source of information is inherently corrupt or racist or biased, then that filters out to the rest of society.
That was a really, really interesting anecdote there from Prince Harry. And this is someone who is at the top of the establishment. So he is having these conversations with people who are incredibly powerful. And that's what he's saying. They're saying to him, watch out. The UK is bigoted, which means that you've got to step carefully, especially given that you've married a mixed race person. I mean, that's what I took from that interview, from that anecdote there. Aaron, what did you make of that comment from Prince Harry?
What a powerful piece of television, Michael. I was almost on the ball. also for a man who is in such privilege, and he's an incredibly privileged person. He's the brother of the future King of England. He's a son of a future King of England, too. One of the most recognizable people on the planet, certainly in Britain. And I think he's entirely right. I don't think the British public are angels. I don't think everybody's wonderful. But I think on a bunch of social issues, economic issues, and race, I think they're nowhere near the tabloids are. And we see that in data. We see that in anecdotes. And I think the Daily Mail, the Sun, are like the worst possible people imaginable, made into a newspaper, read by, until quite recently, the Sun used to get read by 3 million people a day. Now it's below 1 million. They don't release their statistics anymore. But I think he's absolutely spot on. The media in this country is incredibly racist. The people are less so. Of course, you have issues there too, but nowhere near as bad. And I thought it was a really, really sharp, smart analysis. Where did that come from? To have his background and to have that kind of insight, I think he's a smart guy. Now, I don't mean that he's doing, he's reading Lacan or Foucault. I think he's a critical thinker. And I think he's a skeptic about what he's told. And he's obviously been in receipt of a bunch of information over his life because of his class position. And he kind of doesn't seem to agree with quite a lot of it. And I think that's really impressive. And you have to kind of look at his experience of his mother and the way that she was treated. And I think it can only be an experience that unique, which blows apart that kind of privilege. And I think he probably wouldn't be like this had it not been for the way that his mother was treated and, of course, her tragic death. So it was a really powerful piece of video. And I think what's most interesting is that the British public would also agree. When you look at institutions in this country with the least trust, you're looking at politicians, used car salesmen, and journalists are at the bottom. That's not a good thing. You want journalists and politicians to be trusted for democracy to function, but they're not. And so I think he's really got his finger on the pulse there, certainly more so than what the other person was saying in terms of, well, actually, people are bigoted, therefore the media is. Not accurate. Anybody who's familiar with Rupert Murdoch's views as owner of The Sun on a personal level, how he drove the journalistic editorial agenda at that newspaper for decades, knows that it wasn't about reflecting public opinion. It was about reflecting what this bigoted old Australian thought. And that's not just my opinion. That's out there in a bunch of literature on Murdoch, on the history of the Sun newspaper under his stewardship. So congratulations, Harry. You've really nailed that piece of analysis. I couldn't agree more.
As I said, that original statement came from their executive director, but it was, on behalf of the Society of Editors. It turns out that there was a bit of a backlash within the organization. Some people disagreed with what had been said, and today they have released the following. So this is agreed by the entire board of the organization. So they say the Society of Editors has a proud history of campaigning for freedom of speech and the vital work that journalists do in a democracy to hold power to account. Our statement on Meghan and Harry was made in that spirit, but did not reflect what we all know, that there is a lot of work to be done in the media to improve diversity and inclusion. We will reflect on the reaction our statement prompted and work towards being part of the solution. So a bit of a rollback from the attitude, I suppose, of the director of that organization. But it was all too late to lose respect from quite a lot of journalists and a lot of the public, and also from the host of ITV's Loose Women, Charlene White. So she has pulled out of the Society of Editors Press Awards today, which is a fairly significant vote of no confidence. So in terms of whether or not Britons thought that Harry and Meghan have been treated unfairly by the royal family, which is, of course, the story which prompted this whole fallout within the media, the public is completely split. So 32% think Harry and Meghan were treated fairly, 32% think they were treated unfairly, and 36% don't have an opinion. So straight down the middle. And then you can see when it comes to age, again, it's completely correlated with age. So 61% of 18 to 24-year-olds think they were treated unfairly. That goes down to 15% when you're over 65. And it just increases across the age groups, people who side with the royals or side with the Queen and the senior royal family, as opposed to Harry and Meghan. Aaron, I want your final thoughts on the generational divide here. I mean, it does seem like this, even though, this interview isn't going to bring down the royal family, it could sharpen the generational divides, which are already quite extreme in this country.
Your thing about this couldn't bring down the royal family. Obviously, this one interview won't bring down the royal family, but the comparison that's being made between Martin Bashir with Princess Diana with Panorama decades ago and this, I don't think that's correct. Because, of course, that was one piece of news journalism. That was one broadcast. This is now Harry's life. This is Meghan's life. And, I think that's the real concern for the royal family, Michael, is that this is now his brand, his value as a public figure. Look, it's not just going to be to criticize the royals, but it's to also say things like, I don't think Britain's a bigoted country. I think the media is. When you've got a former prince saying that, the establishment has big, big, big problems. And some of our viewers, our audience, are saying, why Novara talking about the royal family so much? This kind of royal gossip. It's a big deal. It's a huge deal because Britain isn't a modern bourgeois state. It has these feudal remnants, including the royal family. So for Prince Harry to break this omerta, this is like one of the Corleones saying to, Vito Corleone, I'm out and I'm going to grass you up to the cops. It's a big deal. And I think generationally, yes, of course it matters, but this is going to be a real drip in terms of the credibility of the royal family. The legitimacy and the authority of the monarchy as a symbol is their distance from everyday life. And the fact that Harry's going to be on Spotify and Netflix and Oprah, God knows what projects they're going to have in the pipes. He might be the executive producer for a documentary on the history of the royal family, or who knows? Completely different. And it's a challenge, the likes of which the royal family has never seen before. So I don't think we can underestimate it.
Well, it's why they'll probably be very careful going through tunnels. I suppose in terms of the risk that it poses to the royal family. Let's go to some comments on Ian Murray. Henry VIII fake with a £5 super chat says, some people think they've picked a hill to die on, but this guy picked a ditch. Very well put. Mr. Mefusela with $5. The ironic thing is that the British royals are immigrants of German and Greek heritage. I suppose where's the irony? What's the irony? I suppose that they're a bit xenophobic, but they're not so xenophobic against the Germans and the Greeks. They're more xenophobic against people of non-European heritage, I think, in general. Nishat with $14.99. Most editors are white, male, middle-aged, middle-class, straight men who either don't know about racism or don't care. I think that is very clear from everything we've seen over the past 4 days, and to be honest, the past 50 years, or past forever. Jake Label with $10 Canadian says, as a Canadian, I really enjoy the monarchy coverage. I'd love to see the Novara crew tackle Kanzuk someday, which is, I think, so it's the economic relations between Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. It's what lots of Brexiteers were talking about when we come out of the European Union. We can have this union of British language, or there's not British, English language countries, economic relations. I have to admit, I haven't looked very much into it, but I probably should, especially on the prompt of that comment. And Alex Berry with $9.99. Novara Media is a fantastic example of what the news media should be. Always insightful and thought-provoking. My family never miss a show. Keep up the good work. Thank you so much, Alex Berry. I really do. We all really do appreciate that. Next story. Britain's NHS workers are still reeling from the Tory government's announcement that they would only be recommending nurses and other healthcare staff get a 1% pay rise. This would be below expected inflation and therefore a pay cut. Its announcement, which has united opposition to Boris Johnson in Parliament and, according to pollsters, is also opposed by the vast majority of the British public. Keir Starmer led on the issue at today's PMQs.
Mr. Speaker, my mum was a nurse. My sister was a nurse. My wife works in the NHS. I know what it means to work for the NHS. When I clapped for carers, I meant it. He clapped for carers, then he shut the door in their face at the first opportunity. And the more you look at the Prime Minister's decision, the worse it gets. Because it's not just a pay cut, it's a broken promise too. Time and time again, he said that the NHS wouldn't pay the price for this pandemic. 2 years ago, he made a promise to the NHS. Here in black and white, his document, it commits to a minimum pay rise of 2.1%. It's been budgeted for and now it's being taken away. He shakes his head. His MPs voted for it. So why, after everything the NHS has done for us, is he now breaking promise after promise?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, he voted against the document in question, and to crown the absurdity of his point. Under this government, we have massively increased funding for our amazing NHS, with the result, as I say, there are 6,500 more doctors this year than there were last year, 18,000 more healthcare workers, and 10,600 more nurses. And we're going to go on, Mr. Speaker, and we are going to deliver our promises. I can tell the right honourable gentleman. We are going to go on and we're going to build 40 more hospitals, and we're going to recruit 50,000 more nurses, and we're going to get on and deliver on our pledges to the British people. And we're going to do that because of our sound management of the economy and the fastest vaccine rollout programme of any comparable country, which, frankly, if we'd followed his precepts and his ideas, we would certainly not have been able to achieve.
Now, many things to comment on about that exchange. First of all, surprise, surprise, Boris Johnson told a lie. This just keeps happening. Labour did not, in fact, vote against a pay rise for nurses. This was put to his press secretary after Prime Minister's questions. Paul Waugh from the Huffington Post tweeted, PM's press secretary Allegra Stratton refuses at least 12 times to answer this question. Does Boris Johnson accept he was wrong to say Labour voted against an NHS pay rise? Instead, she repeatedly says the Speaker has accepted John Ashworth's clarification, i.e. saying the PM lied, and the matter is now closed. So that was just a porky. He tried to deflect from the issue by saying Labour voted against the pay rise. They didn't. It was a lie. Second, what is there to mention about that exchange? Just quite how much there is for Keir Starmer to draw upon to show how unjust this decision is. So as Keir Starmer put forward there, before the pandemic, the government had budgeted for a 2.1% increase in nurses' pay. So that was, on record what they were going to offer. Then during the pandemic, they made the claim, they made it very clear that health workers should not bear any of the cost of coronavirus. Of course they did. Of course they put themselves in harm's way. They slept very poorly because they were constantly working overtime. Nurses have given over so much during this pandemic, but he at least suggested, the government is not going to make you take on any more than you already are. You shouldn't pay the cost of this crisis. However, now this crisis is, beginning to wane. The government are saying, oh, actually, you probably should pay for this crisis. Actually, we don't have enough money now, which means that we said you'd get 2.1%. But after all of the hard work you've done, after you've put your lives at risk, after some of your colleagues have tragically passed away, no, we're changing our mind. We're going to give you a pay cut, right? I mean, it could not be more outrageous, which, it does make me wonder what the Conservatives are doing. Finally, we should also point out that while Tory politicians like to sort of suggest, but they've had all of these generous pay rises over the last 2 years, what that all ignores is that wages are still 3% lower for nurses than they were in 2010. We can see that on this graph from Full Fact. So you can see there that the starting salary for nurses has gone from 26,000 in 2010, and then basically just falls consistently all the way until 2018. Starts to pick up a little bit from then, but it's still 3% lower than it was a decade ago. So, the rich have got richer in that decade, nurses have got poorer. You can also see from that graph that full-time equivalent average basic pay has also fallen through that period. But what we know, good economics, if there are low wages in the private sector, the way you support that to be different is not to cut wages in the public sector. We want to put more demand into the economy so that we can have a higher wage society. Aaron, what do you, I know what you make of this in terms of that you think it's going to, an absolute outrage that the Tories are suggesting a pay cut for nurses at this point in time. But this does seem like it's causing political problems for the Conservatives. Do you see another U-turn incoming?
Yes and no. I don't think Keir Starmer and the Labour front bench is going to make a difference. But I think you're right. I think it's such an emotive issue and so many people feel that the government have got this wrong that I think they will have to do a U-turn, yes. But Keir Starmer, come on, man. The thing about when we clapped, I meant it. Is that meant to be some savage line? Because clapping is performative. It doesn't mean anything. So I thought his PMQs today was probably the most effective one he's done. No, I'm not talking Boris Johnson did look awkward. I thought, when he's comfortable in what he's saying, I think he can deliver a line. The problem is that he never knows what he believes. But this is one of the few issues where they actually committed. This isn't me Keir bashing just randomly, Michael. It feels like he's not willing. He's pulling his punches with Boris Johnson because he's a lawyer and that's kind of what you do. So yeah, he can be actually, I thought, for instance, responding to the budget, I thought some of the jokes were good. I think he's improving in terms of his ability to think on his feet and to take people to task. But you know, with politicians, Michael, here's the thing. Here's my theory. People want a politician to make their life slightly better, right? To solve some problems and to not create any new ones. They have quite low expectations. But second to that, or sometimes even preceding that, is to be entertaining, is to be captivating. Yes, there's a huge political outrage here with the NHS staff not being rewarded in the way that they are. But if that's not framed in a captivating way by the opposition, I think they're letting the side down. And that's not to say the government won't U-turn. Like I said, it's already such a huge issue. But I think Labour could be making more hay about this. I don't think they're going in as deep as they could be. And also there's an economic argument here, which is to say you're economically illiterate. The NHS is the largest employer in the country. Give them a 10% pay rise. That's going to be a huge boost to everybody's back pocket because of the increased spending power they've got. Labour just aren't confident in making these really easy common sense arguments. They're not.
No, I think that final point makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think I share many of the critiques you had of the Labour Party, but when it comes to will the government perform a U-turn, I mean, we do have the evidence there that they will do many. With this opposition, you can credit the opposition or you can credit other forces in society, Marcus Rashford, but we know that this government are willing to take on fights they cannot win. And there are sort of two theories here. One is to say they've picked this battle specifically to divide Britain's working class, to say, look, these are public sector workers who are greedy for pay rises while you're worried about your jobs, which is the aggressive line the Conservatives are taking, and the idea that they think this is a productive battle to have. The other is that this was a bit of a slip up, and that ultimately going to war with nurses at the end of a pandemic was a bit of a strange political thing to do. So they will have to settle for a pay rise of at least 2.1%, hopefully more. Of course, the unions are demanding 12.5%, which would put their wages above where they were 10 years ago, which seems fairly reasonable to me after working through a deadly pandemic for quite a while during that period without enough PPE. So putting their health at risk as well as putting in an enormous effort to protect us all from an awful virus. Let's go to our final story after a couple more comments. Mayan Peterson with £20. Great commentary as always. Please wish my partner of 12 years, James, who introduced me to Novara. Well done, James. A happy anniversary for tomorrow. Also, please could Novara cover the global #StopAsianHate movement and its impact in the UK. I have to admit my ignorance of the #StopAsianHate movement. I presume this is related to coronavirus, is it? So it's people targeting people of East Asian origin because they associate the coronavirus with China. I'll have to check the hashtag myself. The 4 nothings with £5. Great as always, fellas. Please say happy birthday to Jennifer Raftis. Huge fan of the show. It's essential tea time viewing in our house. Thank you. Happy birthday to Jennifer Raftis. I am very pleased to be keeping you company while you eat your dinner. Our final story before we go to it. Do like the video. Now, Britain's political establishment revel in the claim that Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party was an abject failure and a moral disgrace. They like to assume it can be treated as a blip in politics as usual and as a traumatic accident that can be dismissed. However, new data suggests our political class, the press, the Prime Minister and Keir Starmer might be taking a risk by trying to expunge Corbyn from mainstream politics. Pollsters Redfield and Wilton polled 2019 Labour voters who they think would make the best Labour leader, Keir Starmer or Jeremy Corbyn. And voters in both the 18 to 24 age bracket and the 25 to 34 bracket chose Jeremy Corbyn. So we can take a look here. So asked who they prefer or who they think makes the best Labour leader, 56% of 18 to 24-year-olds said Jeremy Corbyn. That's compared to 29% who say Keir Starmer, and 46% of 25 to 34-year-olds say Jeremy Corbyn, which is compared to 37% who say Keir Starmer. Now, obviously, if you're looking at that, the totality of that across all of the age groups, it's not amazing results for Jeremy Corbyn. None of it suggests, he should be leader again. But what it does show you is that there is still a significant minority in this country, and it's very much, based on a generational divide, who think that Jeremy Corbyn was a good leader of the Labour Party and don't necessarily want him to be leader of the Labour Party again, but will be absolutely outraged that he has been expelled, essentially, from the parliamentary Labour Party. And across the spectrum of the political class is basically positioned as beyond the pale. And if you have a majority of 2019 Labour voters under 34 who say he's a better leader of the Labour Party than the current leader of the Labour Party. And this is someone who everyone has said, oh, to even consider liking him, that makes you a racist, that makes you deluded. That's really, really not healthy for democracy. And I think essentially you're disenfranchising a lot of people there. Aaron, I want to go to you on this. Do you think that sort of liberals in this country who think that they can just sort of, Jeremy Corbyn was an embarrassing accident, they can sort of basically put him in a wardrobe and say, no one should ever consider this person a politician again or a reasonable member of polite society. If you like him, you're a weirdo. Have they considered the effect that has on a whole generation of younger people who this polling show actually think he did a pretty decent job?
No, is the answer. No. And what's really worrying, Michael, looking at those statistics, is basically Starmer is kind of evens with Jeremy Corbyn amongst under 54s. Actually, the figures for Corbyn are actually surprisingly good. So 45 to 54, I think it was about 32%. That's 1 in 3. That's quite a few people, right? Yeah, 32%. We're not talking like school kids here. We're not talking university undergraduates. We're talking people 45 to 54, people with mortgages, carrying responsibilities, maybe even grandparents. They've got to think about saving for a pension, et cetera, et cetera. And even those people are like, you know what? Yeah, I prefer that guy. 1 in 3. So yeah, I'd say it's evens amongst under 55s. That's a big problem for Keir Starmer, Michael. That's a big, big problem. And, there's been some sort of disagreement about this. Keir Starmer was on the Jeremy Vine show Monday, I believe it was. And from what I interpreted in his comments, because I don't think the question asked was about Corbyn losing the whip, the way he answered it felt to me like he was answering a question about the day that Jeremy Corbyn was suspended from the Labour Party. It was his personal decision. Now, I tweeted about that. People can go listen to that link, or you can go listen to Jeremy Vine's show from Monday. I think it was about 2 hours in. Keir Starmer's whole sort of political brand is that he isn't Jeremy Corbyn. And yet 50% of Labour voters at the last general election, it's 10 million people. The media, David Aronovich and the Times and the Guardian and the Observer, they all want you to think it's, 2 people and a dog. It was 10 million people. No, those 10 million people weren't all racists and anti-Semites and unhinged and irrelevant. No, they weren't. It's a big chunk of British civil society. And you're right. I think the fact that those people are now painted and presented as irrelevant, aren't allowed to basically be represented in public life, shows that we don't live in a democracy. Shows that we live in effectively a one-party state. Don't we? If 10 million people can't decide something politically, if they're not allowed to participate, they aren't viewed as legitimate actors. How can you say that's democracy? If they're not legitimate, how can you say, actually, no, those views can't be represented by a major party in a general election? How's that a democracy in a meaningful sense? So I think, look, I'm going to be real as well, Michael. I think the question about who would be the best leader, Jeremy Corbyn should not be leading the Labour Party anymore. He had 2 cracks of it's true, right? He had 2 cracks of the whip. He was destroyed by the media. The man deserves arrest. He deserves a private life. People around him, his loved ones, his family, you can only do that for so long, right? So I don't think he should be leader and Keir Starmer shouldn't. But I think, my God, it really does reflect on how poor the Starmer leadership is getting. And so quickly, Michael, so quickly. In October, he was sailing. He was sailing. And if you think about the 6-month period he's had since then, I genuinely can't think of a politician who's done such a terrible job, such a U-turn in terms of approval ratings, rhetoric, policies in 6 months. You might say Jo Swinson, but I don't think she came in with kind of high ambitions and the media blowing smoke up her ass. With Starmer, he came in and he had a really impressive beginning, really impressive 4 or 5 months. And then it's just capsized. This is like a rubber dinghy just turning upside down. Now he's in the freezing water. And Jeremy Corbyn's on a shore nearby. He's going, Keir, let me help you out. And Keir Starmer's going, no. If you grab me, I'll drown. Keir, you idiot. This is the way out. Jeremy Corbyn's electoral coalition of 2019 was 10 million people. Build on it. Don't dismantle it.
I think that's such a good way of putting it. I mean, let's look at the overall results, actually. So this is across age groups. So who would make the best Labour leader, Keir Starmer or Jeremy Corbyn? All respondents, 45% say Keir Starmer, 38% say Jeremy Corbyn. Among women, it's really close. 42% say Keir Starmer, 40% say Jeremy Corbyn. Among men, and there's a bigger gap. So 50% say Keir Starmer, 35% say Jeremy Corbyn. That's people who voted for Labour in 2019. Now, as you said, Aaron, this isn't an argument to say, we should therefore make Jeremy Corbyn leader of the Labour Party again, because he is less popular among those voters than Keir Starmer. Also, of course, someone from Keir Starmer's team would be quite right to say, we don't only care about their popularity among 2019 Labour voters. We want to build out on that. We care about his popularity among 2019 Tory voters who might potentially come back to the party. That's all correct. That's quite right. The point I'm making, and I think you're making as well, Aaron, is that this might be a minority, but it's a very significant minority. And if you want to build on, exactly as you put it, Aaron, if you want to build on that coalition and make a party and a platform, a movement that can defeat the Tories at the next general election, you're going to have to treat that significant minority with some respect. I just think it would have been so easy for Keir Starmer to build on that. And instead, he's just put two fingers up at young people, put two fingers up at a huge proportion of Labour's core vote, and it's not going to turn out very well. Going to go just to one more poll, which is potentially the consequence of all of this. At this moment, which of the following individual do you think would be the better Prime Minister for the United Kingdom? Boris Johnson, 50%, that's +2, and Keir Starmer, 27%, -3. So that's since just a week ago, actually. So that's quite a recent change. And Johnson's lead of 23 points is his biggest since June 2020. Aaron, it's not looking good. Do you think they're going to, change their minds? Do you think they're going to try and rebuild those relationships with people who didn't think that, Jeremy Corbyn was the Antichrist?
I think there's a very real possibility the May local elections are going to be terrible for Labour. When I say terrible, I don't mean they're going to crash and lose loads of seats, because 2017 wasn't great either. It was actually the low point for Corbynism when it came to local elections, but I don't think they'll do well in Metro Mayor elections. I don't think they'll do well in Wales and Scotland, particularly Scotland. And I think what will happen is that Starmer and the people around him will blame Corbyn. They'll say, well, we haven't detoxified the party enough. I think that's kind of written in the stars. And Keir Starmer the other day said, we've come a long way, but we've still got a long way to go, from the terrible defeat we had a year ago. Hold on a second. In 2019, Labour got 32% of the vote, right? In 2015, Labour got 30% of the vote. And yet Jeremy Corbyn, I think 8 months into his leadership, you didn't give him that privilege. It was a worse defeat, Keir. It was a worse defeat in terms of percentages and in terms of losing Scotland. And you decided after 8 months amongst 160, 70 of your colleagues that Jeremy Corbyn didn't deserve more time. And yet you're asking for more time. Again, double standard. Again, hypocrisy, which I think are actually things that can be leveled with a great deal of legitimacy when it comes to Keir Starmer. And there's a simple thing which Jeremy Corbyn pulled off in 2017, which basically nobody can talk about, which is that in the 2015 election, there were 4 million, 3.9 million UKIP voters. Everybody assumed they would all go Tory. Everybody, right? If Labour could get 20% of them, great. I think in the final analysis, I think basically it broke the Tories 2-1, not even that. So Labour, for every, 2 Tory UKIP voters they were getting from the 2015 lot, Labour were getting 1, which was massive. That was the reason Labour did really so well. Increased turnout, younger people, but a really large number of former UKIP voters went Labour. And the party has no answer for that, because wait, he's critical of the default common sense on foreign policy. Wait, he doesn't hate immigrants. Wait, he wants to improve public services. These are all the things that we have been saying to ourselves and to the press and to our members for decades, which working class people, white working class people, don't want. And it actually goes back, Michael, to we were talking about this earlier, and I forgot about it. I want to bring it up, which is why was the media so obsessed with bringing Nigel Farage into the conversation over the last 15 years? It was because they're so privileged and they're so immersed in like this effectively aristocratic London-based society. It's a media aristocracy. It's about 1,000 people running the country, 10,000 people, to borrow the kind of a metaphor which has been previously used in terms of how do you understand an establishment. And Nigel Farage was so convenient because you didn't actually have to give working class people or people from the regions or people who are vulnerable and ostracized a voice. You just gave it to Nigel Farage. And he became this stand-in and this conduit for basically all the criticisms of the establishment and the status quo and the EU and Westminster and business as usual. And of course, that's one set of arguments. But there were a number of others. But they didn't want to do that because that'd be too much work. And so I think what Corbyn did in 2017, with winning so many UKIP voters over, has screwed up so much of their common sense, Michael. And I think I think it's so profound and so deep that they've got no way back from it. I think it would really mean them having to renounce some really core economic and political and intellectual commitments, which I don't think they're willing to do. Even somebody like Rachel Reeves, Johnny Reynolds, they're clearly moving left when it comes to economic policy. But in terms of how they want to frame it, they believe, I think just as much as Keir Starmer, that people that voted UKIP in 2015 will never, ever vote Labour. They voted Labour in 2017, right? And you've got to work out why, and you've got to reproduce it. I don't think Keir Starmer's the man to do that. Sorry.
I mean, they are trying to do that, aren't they? But they're just trying to do that with social conservatism as opposed to...
That's the ambition, of course, yeah.
Radicalism or isolationist foreign policy or whatever.
They understand that's the problem, right? I mean, we agree. You need to win back those Tory voters in 2019 in these Leave voting constituencies. Nobody's denying that's the problem. What's super strange is that, hold on, we have a baseline where that did happen. 2017 was pretty successful, and nobody wants to talk about it. And as long as Labour doesn't want to talk about 2017, they're not going to win anything. How can you, if you've got an example of, wow, we won 12.5 million votes, we increased our share of the vote by 9%, but no, of course it doesn't tell us anything remotely interesting or relevant or pertinent to how we can do it again. Are you kidding me? That's the most ridiculous thing you could possibly do. And what's even more worrying, Michael, is that Keir Starmer, when he was asked about his poor ratings, he said, we lost the last election because of anti-Semitism. It was an issue. Labour didn't deal with it properly. Of course, communities didn't vote Labour because of it, but it didn't. The Tories didn't win because of anti-Semitism. Any data out there shows that's clearly incorrect. Clearly, it was Brexit. Yes, it was Corbyn's personal brand. It was infighting. It was the fact that Boris Johnson was offering certainty about what would happen straight after the general election. It was nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Maybe 5% of people. 5% too many, by the way. But that's not the point. So if your analysis of why you've just lost is completely wrong, and you're not willing to even countenance that this other thing where you did really well might have some relevance to what you're trying to achieve, you haven't got hope in hell. You're flying blind. You're walking around in a dark room looking for a black cat which doesn't exist.
Yeah, that was very well put. Very well put. They should learn from 2017, and their analysis of why we lost in 2019 isn't particularly convincing. Thank you so much for watching tonight's show. We had some good numbers, which is always a pleasure. If you haven't already, do go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. If you do already, thank you so much. Make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel. Aaron Bastani, it's been a pleasure as always.
My pleasure, Michael.
You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.